Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar that Alberta Milk is hosting with other presentators from Alberta Agriculture and Alberta EFP. We'd like to welcome you to our proAction 6th and final module presentation for environment. So just before we get started, I want to mention just a few webinar housekeeping items. So as a participant, you will not be able to turn on your microphone or your camera. But if you are having any technical difficulties, please use the chat button to talk to the hosts. Kira McMillan is monitoring that chat box. Once the presentation for each of the environment module questions has happened, we will have a 5-minute Q&A. So please use the Q&A button to type in your questions for the speakers. You will also be able to see other participants' questions and can like a question to help ensure that it's asked. If your question does not get answered during this Q&A period, our speakers will be working to respond to your question via the chat. We will also follow up on any unanswered questions via email after the webinar. So throughout the presentations, we do have poll questions that will pop up on your screen. We would like you to participate by just clicking your answer and then hitting the submit button. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be available to you to rewatch if you happen to miss anything or just for clarification. And the link will be provided to the producer body following this session. So today's agenda, we'll just introduce the speakers just so everyone knows who is who. We'll introduce the module, why it is happening. We will review each of the module requirements. So there'll be a proAction piece as well as a provincial regulation piece. And after each of those requirements, as I mentioned, there will be that 5-minute question period. So if we don't have time to answer it in those 5 minutes, we will have another Q&A at the end, which is on this agenda as well. So as an introduction of the speakers, as many of you know, my name is Morgan Hoban and I am Alberta Milk's proAction coordinator. Representing Alberta EFP is Murray Warnke. He is an EFP technician. We also do have Devin Lloyd and Lisa Nadeau with us. They were on the call to help answer any EFP related questions. And from Alberta Agriculture and Forestry's Natural Resource Management branch, we have Vince Murray and Trevor Wallace, as well as Deanne Madsen. She is here to help answer any questions relating to the provincial regulations. So why an environment module? There are many benefits on the farm side of things, which as dairy farmers you are already doing on a daily basis. So helping to identify and mitigate risks, enhancing soil health and biodiversity, making more efficient use of resources, and preserving your land for future generations. There are benefits for the industry. As part of proAction's vision, we know farmers are providing assurance to consumers about current farm practices. So you're really demonstrating the value that the dairy industry places on the health of the natural environment. And the benefit to society, we are reducing environmental footprint and ultimately continuing to supply dairy products to Canadians. So Dairy Farmers of Canada through proAction are not the only groups in Alberta or even Canada that have implemented environmental programs for their industry. Such programs include Egg Farmers of Alberta Producer Environmental Egg Program, BC Fruit Growers Association, and the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, just to name a few. Many large food companies have also recently made policies around sourcing products with environment or sustainability factors. So for example, McCain's requires all growers to complete an EFP every 5 years and complete a sustainability survey every year. And I'm sure many of you are aware that McDonald's is also working on sustainability requirements for beef, and our dairy processors are also looking for that proof of sustainability. And so lastly, sustainability requirements are now also emerging in every major dairy industry worldwide, in addition to their general regulations. So the environment module, the environment questions will become part of the validation checklist for farmers with full validations due after September 1st of this year, 2021. So there are 5 requirements, EN1 to EN5. You'll see 2 of those questions are major minor questions and 3 are demerit questions. For your first validation with environment questions, you can receive 10 demerits and carry them forward if you do receive them. However, for your second and subsequent validations, you will only be able to carry forward 5 demerits. So similar to the other modules in proAction. So the big thing to note, as farmers, you need to make sure that you're complying with the applicable federal, provincial, and municipal county regulations that are already there, which I think many are doing already anyways. But these regulations are not specifically being validated by proAction. So the Environment Module Reference Manual was sent out as an insert in the March Milking Times newsletter. So all of you should have received it. However, if you did not, or it's been misplaced, please let me know and we'll make sure to get you either a hard copy or a electronic copy. The reference manual describes and explains each of the requirements, highlights the mandatory sections, lists the questions in the questionnaire, and will provide a glossary for terms. So before we get started in reviewing each of the module's requirements, we're going to start to try this poll the audience. So a poll with a question will pop up and you just respond to it by selecting your answer and pressing submit. It is anonymous. The other speakers will also be having polls, as I mentioned before, and the answers from these polls are really providing us insight as to what is currently happening on farm. So the first poll is going to talk about EFP, the first question. So first question, have you completed an environmental farm plan? Your choices are yes, no, don't know. And the second question is your EFP valid? So it needs to have been completed within the last 10 years. So we've got almost everybody voted. We'll just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, we'll end it there. So looks like out of the people participating today, over half of you, 62% roughly, have an EFP. So that's a great start. And for those that don't know, that's what we are here to tell you as to how to find out about that. And about, I guess, a third have valid EFPs, aren't valid. So we'll talk about how the renewal process works. And also, if you're not sure if it's valid, we do have the ability to explain how to figure that out as well. So that's great. Thank you for participating. So as you can see, the first question, EN1, talks about environmental farm plan. So do you have one? And the key points to this really is that it's completed within your province, so that you are completing an Alberta EFP, and that it is valid by the time of your full validation, and that you have received that you've completed it and you have received your EFP certificate or statement of completion. So this must be available, that certificate of completion must be available for your validator to see. The validator is not concerned so much as what the answers in the EFP are, but rather just the completion of it. And so it will really depend on, like I said, before your validation. So that could be for those of you coming up in September prior to that, or it could be 6 months from now, as long as it's done before your full validation. So based on that date. With that, we'll turn it over to Murray Warnke, and he will provide more details about how to complete the Alberta EFP.
Good morning. I farm here in the county of Wetaskiwin and have been helping out with environmental farm plans almost basically since the inception of the program, at least the last 15, 16 years. And probably I've actually been to a number of your farms across the province. I noticed some of the names that registered. And hopefully, through the quality milk program, most of what you've done already makes it quite simple to do an environmental farm plan. And it is a whole risk, like it says, whole farm environmental risk assessment tool. It is a general tool that analyzes all your environmental risks in each chapter. The most in-depth one, of course, is water, because without good quality water, we don't have really much to work with. And it is completely voluntary. You complete it on your own time, and but there are trained people to come out and help. We have approximately 45 trained EFP technicians across the province. Some of them are restricted as to where they can go, you know, maybe within their county or region. I can actually travel across the province with COVID restrictions now in place, but and to help if you need help completing your farm plan. With the conversion to online, the environmental farm plan is that much simpler, I think, to do, and it's quite easy, step by step, just using your computer. And it is free, like it says, to do. There is no charge. If I do come to your farm or somebody comes out, it's great to have coffee and cookies, whatever, but and all the information that is kept confidential. It's only between you and your family when you do it. No one else gets to see it. We do the technician also helps you review your environmental farm plan to ensure that we help you do the best possible plan out there. And our job is to provide other references or certain material, other suggestions or ideas that you might incorporate to do your plan. And at various times, of course, I think we all know that there is funding available to do some of the improvements or reducing your environmental risks. Depending on your farm, of course, the size or complexity of your farm, I believe most farm plans can be completed within one day, but depends on your schedules and how much time you have to work on it. The reasons, of course, to complete, like I said, is around water, basically, and soil, and it's creating more awareness of the risks on your farm. Like I tell a lot of people, we as farmers, we get busy, and there's sometimes we don't realize some of the things we overlook on our operations that can be simply changed or improved upon to reduce that risk. It is essential to produce sustainable crops and livestock, which we've already talked about, that Morgan mentioned, and that seems to be the increasing wave of how things are going. It also can increase your efficiency and reduce production costs. And like I did mention, you can become eligible for funding under the new CAP program right now, which is, I guess this slide is a little older, but Canadian Agricultural Partnership Program, where there is some funding available for certain things. And as Morgan mentioned, it's key for marketing and sustainable sourcing. With the expiries, like I noticed in the poll, 2/3 of you have an environmental farm plan. Effective April 1st, almost across the country, EFPs have changed to have an expiration date after 10 years. So if yours is completed prior to that, you need to update it. And like I said earlier, it's easier to do it online. And once you have it online, it is quite easy to go through, use it as a reference to go back. And as you make improvements or changes, you can update those in your book, so that after the 10 years, it is quite easy then to renew it. We'll go to the next slide, I guess. And like as already mentioned, there are good reasons to do the environmental farm plan. It just helps you with your overall stewardship of the land. And just a couple of quotes from various farmers. We also, like was mentioned, that potato producers are required to do environmental farm plan. And RAR Malting was another major organization that has stepped forward and said that if you want to raise malt barley and sell that to RAR, you need to have an environmental farm plan that's valid and up to date. And that kind of short and sweet of we're available to help you to do or renew your environmental farm plan. And just feel free to contact the office, the central office, or you can go direct onto Alberta EFP and register yourself, and you'll be connected with one of the technicians across the province to help you complete your environmental farm plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murray. I'd like to open up the question and answer period. So you can click on the Q&A button to type in your questions for either Morgan or Murray regarding the environmental farm plan. So while we wait for those to come in, Murray, if producers had originally completed their EFP by paper and now they're trying to renew online, do they essentially have to redo the EFP online for their renewal?
Yes, they do have to complete it totally online to renew. They can use their old book as a reference. The online version is so much more improved from the paper copy that it is quite easy to do. You just click and drag most of the times, or just click and point to choose your answers, and it just helps you go through. There's a lot of good reference material for the questions, and if you're uncertain of some things, there's little asterisks that if you click on that, it'll explain what the question means if you're uncertain as to what if you have that risk.
Great. And if producers are unsure whether or not their EFP is expired, what should they do to confirm that?
I believe they can check with the office, and they will let them know whether their environmental farm plan is expired. Okay. We as I do not have that information for anybody offhand from the paper copies. I do for my producers that have completed them online since the inception of the online version.
Hi, Murray. I'm just going to answer a little quickly. Yeah, so if a producer does want to know if their EFP is still valid, then they can contact us at the Alberta EFP office.
Great, thanks, Devin. So questions come in. How come there's such a long validity date? A lot can change on most farms in 10 years, or is that information updated when you renew?
Yeah, so that's the opportunity you have then to go in and make the changes on your farm within those 10 years. And when you do come up to renew it, then after 10 years, it'll be quite simple to go through the process.
Great. And so we have time for one more question. So the question is, I would like help to find information on how to find a company that deals with drilling wells, abandoned wells, information on wells, shutting down a well. We took over a farm and we don't know how much information about the wells on our land.
That's a very good question, because one of the biggest concerns across the province is old abandoned wells that haven't been decommissioned properly. And probably the best is to work with your local well driller and or Alberta water specialist. for information about the wells. There is an online in the chapter 2 on the water section. There is reference to go to the website that shows most of the wells that have been drilled in the province since about the 50s or 60s have all been registered, and you can go there to get a well report on your different wells.
Great, thank you very much, Murray. So I'm going to close the Q&A for this section, but please continue to type your questions into the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them at the end of the webinar. So now we'll move on to our next section.
So the second question, EN2, has to do with an environmental questionnaire. So have you completed the questionnaire on soil health, greenhouse gases, biodiversity, silage, seepage, and plastic waste? So the key points for this question is that it needs to be completed every 2 years prior to your full validation. So it links up with your full validation schedule, and you must show proof of completion, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. The requirement for this is that it's only completed, not that any specific actions are taken on farm depending upon what you answer in that questionnaire. The questionnaire is really a self-evaluation and learning tool. You're not validated on what you answer, only once again that it's completed, so similar to the EFP. You can see this as a tool that will help to make improvements on farm, and you can see your change over time. And the information that's collected from this question is similar to that of the cattle assessments. So Dairy Farmers of Canada will anonymously use this data for communication and planning purposes. It helps to showcase as part of our reports and whatnot to stakeholders and consumers the excellent work that you as dairy farmers are doing in the area of environmental stewardship. So there are 4 sections in this environmental questionnaire that link to soil health, greenhouse gases, biodiversity, and then there's that other category that includes the silage, seepage, and plastic waste. And there are 11 questions in total for this questionnaire, so it's not too long. So in order to complete the questionnaire and obtain that proof of completion, you must enter it into your answers into the National Electronic Administrative System, also known as NEAS. So many of you may be familiar with this. It's an online proAction tool where you can actually submit your self-declarations online, find all of your validation activity dates, find all your cattle assessment reports, so both the herd summary and peer report, and now it'll be your portal to submit your environmental questionnaire answers. So when you submit it in NEAS, a completion letter is generated, and that is your proof of completion for the validator. So if you cannot or you do not have access to NEAS, you will need to fill in a paper version of the questionnaire and send it to Alberta Milk for the proAction coordinator or myself to submit on your behalf. Once that's submitted, you will then receive a copy of that completion letter to include in your records for the validator. So you could include it, be able to show it through your email, save it on the computer, print it off and put it into your proAction binder, whatever works best for you. So for any NEAS account setup or for information, please contact me to help you get set up. So as mentioned before, the questionnaire is a self-evaluation tool. Points have been assigned to each of the questions, and you actually have the ability to view your score, but that is optional. It is not a mandatory thing to have a score. This option will highlight areas of strength and evaluate opportunities for further action. Once again, this aggregate data is used by DFC for future communications and planning efforts. With that, are there any questions on the environmental question?
So please go ahead and use the Q&A button to type in any questions for this module requirement. And so Morgan, I think you already mentioned this, but just to confirm, how often does the questionnaire need to be done? And is it something that has to be completed by September 1st of this year, or is it more related to the date of your validation?
It needs to be completed every 2 years, so in combination with your full validation cycle. And it would be similar to your EFP that you'd want to have it completed prior to your full validation. You could have it done now if you would like to, but yes, as long as it pairs up with before your full validation, that is the main component.
Great, so we'll just wait a minute to see if any other questions are going to come in for this section. All right, if there's no other questions, we'll move on to EN3. If anything comes to mind, please use the Q&A box and we will get to those at the end of the webinar. Oh, sorry, Morgan, I'm going to interrupt you. There is one question that's come in. Are the questionnaires available on NEAS already?
They are not quite available yet. There should be probably April, May, but we will be sure to let everybody know when there is the availability to submit it online for sure.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so we're moving on to EN3 that has to deal with milking center wastewater. So just before we get started into these next 3 questions, I just want to first say that DFC is currently working on the validator protocol for these last 3 questions. It's not quite as cut and dried as the first 2. So when those have been confirmed, Alberta Milk will be sure to share those with you as a producer, either through an article in the Milking Times, as a direct mail out, or even possibly in person, if that's allowed as an update this summer. But so with that, we'll move on to this next question. So the question is your milking center wastewater managed with proper storage or regulatory approved treatment system? So the key points here is that disposing milking center wastewater in an environmentally responsible manner that does not contaminate soil, groundwater, or surface water. So ultimately, it should not be entering directly into a ditch or stream. There are several management options that may be implemented on farm that do meet these requirements, such as separate storage, septic tank, sediment tank, constructed wetland, and or a vegetated filter strip. So there are a few considerations to managing milking center wastewater. Adequate storage to manage volume, regular maintenance, not draining directly into water bodies or groundwater, secondary containment, and upgrades that happen as necessary. So with that, I will turn it over to Vince Murray, the AOPA engineer, who will speak to the associated provincial regulations for this question.
Okay. Just maybe give a second for the poll to finish. So looks like most people pipe it to the lagoon. So let's look at what those rules are. This wastewater really falls into a gray area. So if it goes into the lagoon, that's great, that's acceptable. Then it's just regulated as manure. So that's all fine. If it goes into a septic system, then we follow the rules for septic. If it goes somewhere else, well, that really falls into that gray area. Probably the legislation that applies is Alberta environment legislation. And I can't really tell you what would be acceptable or not acceptable there. But generally their legislation is if it's staying on your property, not going into a road ditch or into a water body, then it's probably fine. So that's as best I can tell you for the regulations right now. Like I said, this is not the most well-defined or clearest topic. But if there's any questions, we can take a few of those now.
Sure, I'll open up the question and answer period. So please use the Q&A box to type in your questions for either Morgan or Vince. So I guess, Vince, in your opinion, if most producers are piping their wastewater to the lagoon, is there any issues with that? Or, that's a great job. There's nothing else they need to worry about.
No, there's no concerns with that. Like you said, as soon as that goes into the lagoon, it's considered mixed with manure, and therefore it's manure. So that's not an issue. They just handle it like they do their manure.
Perfect. So there's a couple questions that have come in. What if the wastewater was set up to go into a ditch way back in the 80s?
Well, like I said, that's going to fall under Alberta environment legislation, and that might still be okay, although probably prefer not to. We wouldn't know if it's acceptable or not unless the environment does an assessment and determines if there's a risk. So my advice would be to consider moving it to something else, but you're probably fine to continue that way until you're told it's not. But if any harm ever happened, like it got into a river or stream, I mean, there are fines that could be levied. So probably something you want to consider looking into an alternative in the near future.
Okay. There's another question here. Is it legal to make a compost pile rather than having a lagoon?
Well, that'll depend on your type of manure, right? So if you're talking about the manure itself, we'll talk about that here a little bit more in a bit, but it depends on your manure.
Okay. Are there any more questions for Vince regarding milking center wastewater? All right, if not, we'll move on to our next section. And again, you can keep putting questions in the Q&A box that we can answer later.
All right, so question 4, is your manure storage adequate to avoid contamination of surface and groundwater and to avoid spreading manure on frozen, snow-covered or saturated ground? So the key points again is really centered around avoiding contamination of surface and groundwater, wanting to avoid spreading manure on frozen, snow-covered or saturated ground. There are several management options here as well that may be implemented on farm, and things to consider in regards to timing of manure application, plans in place, should there be crops that are harvested late, whether there's any unusual weather circumstances that may play a role, and what other rules around provincial government authorization might be here. So once again, a few considerations when managing manure storage, whether there's adequate storage to manage that volume, that it's regularly inspected, that it does not drain directly into those water bodies or groundwater that may be near, that there might be a secondary containment option, and that it's upgraded as necessary. So there may be a few polls coming up next, but other than that, we can pass it on to Vince for the provincial regulations. So as you can see, there's one poll in regards to if you've made any changes to your dairy since January 1st of 2002.
right. So it looks like quite a few of you have made some changes, and that's good, but it gives me an idea of which slides to focus on here. So before I get too far into specifically answering information on these questions, I thought I better go back and talk a little bit about the legislation I deal with, which is the Agricultural Operation Practices Act, or AOPA. It's owned and maintained by Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. And what that legislation does is it requires you to get a permit before you do construction to expand or modify an existing manure storage or to build a newer manure storage. And as far as compliance goes, you have to have that permit before construction starts. Any construction that happened after January 1st, 2002, without a permit, could be met with a compliance action. And then, just in general, you have to follow all the permit conditions and any of the regulations to stay in compliance. It is the Natural Resources Conservation Board, the NRCB, that issues those permits and does the enforcement. So they're the ones you would generally talk to when you're involved in this. But it is Alberta Agriculture that looks after the legislation. So part of explaining that was to get into this part, which is the what happened with existing operations. So anything that existed January 1st, 2002 was given a permit on that date by AOPA. So in a lot of cases, that permit is just a blank piece of paper. There's nothing on it until the NRCB gets involved. And at that point, they would deem the capacity of that permit and tell you what facilities were deemed to have that permit. Usually this assessment happens either at the request of the applicant. So generally that's because of financing or a transfer of ownership, that they need something to give to the bank. So they'll ask the NRCB for that. And the other most common reason that this is done is when a producer comes in for a permit for something new, the NRCB will deem the capacity and assess the existing facilities. And then the final reason that this would happen is if there is a complaint, then the NRCB would get involved at that time. So like I said, when the NRCB comes out and deems that capacity, they're also going to assess those facilities for risk to see if there needs to be a change. And that can be everything from relatively minor things to having to get a permit to do some upgrades. So when I looked at what the question is that you have to answer here, it really breaks into three components. And so I broke the rules under AOPA down into those three basic components. And the first one we'll look at is surface water. So what AOPA says is that you can't construct a facility within a 1 in 25 year floodplain, or because that's not known in most of the province, you have to stay 1 meter above the highest known flood, and you have to stay 30 meters away from common bodies of water. You are also required to provide run-on control and runoff control. Run-on is the runoff that comes onto your property, so that's relatively clean water, and then runoff would be the manure contaminated water. So you have to control that. Typically, that's pretty simple. If you're building a barn, you build it above grade, you have walls there that will deflect clean water away from the manure and help contain the manure in the facility. And the same thing with our lagoons and other manure storages, we put berms around them. The thing with berms, you have to provide some erosion control so that runoff water or run-on water doesn't erode it, right? Now, because we have some operations here that haven't made any changes since 2002, if you're going to get that deemed capacity and the NRCB comes out to do an assessment, they're going to look at the facilities you have and see if they're in a good enough condition and able to function to do these jobs. So they don't necessarily have to meet the standards, but they have to be functional. So the next question that I had, or next section that I was dealing with was, whoops, sorry, was to do with groundwater protection. And with this section, the main way that we protect groundwater is with the use of liners. So all manure storages, all collection areas have to have a liner. That's all of our pits, our barns, the lagoons, our outdoor solid pads. They all have to have some sort of protection, and that could be a natural protective layer, a compacted clay liner, a concrete, or synthetic liner. Now, if we have a liquid manure storage, then we have to provide some protection from erosion and damage, and that's at our agitation points, our pumping points, and even the discharge from the pipes from the barns. You don't need to get too worried about this slide, but I just thought I would show that you know, the requirements that you have to meet vary with the type of manure, whether it be solid, liquid, or with the type of liner that you're going to use. So the a naturally occurring protective layer is just your native soil. Is there enough there to do the job? And a compacted clay liner, we take some of that material and we compact it down with enough force to meet these requirements. Those two requirements are actually found directly in the regulations. Concrete is a little bit different in that the regulations say you can use something else other than soil if it's equivalent to, and we've developed a guideline for concrete for the different manure types, and it really varies by strength of the concrete. And then if you're going to use a synthetic liner, which is also very common in our liquid manure storages, those generally have to be engineered. So liners are our main protection, but we also have some setbacks that we have to meet to further protect groundwater. And the main ones are that we have to stay at least a meter above the water table and at the time of construction, and at least a meter above the groundwater resource. So the picture I have on here is the simplest one I could show. So this is a liner, constructed liner of some kind over a fairly porous material that actually leads to an unconfined groundwater resource. So we have to stay 1 meter above that water table at the time of construction. And that's very important at the time of construction, because we know when we build a manure storage, the water table will probably rise up below that storage. And in this case, the water table is also our groundwater resource, so we have to stay a meter above that as well. The other setback that we have is from actual water wells or springs. You must construct 100 meters away from a water well, and that's to provide protection that if in some instance we had an overflow or a leak of some kind, that the manure wouldn't get to that well and be able to run down either inside the casing or down the outside of the casing. So that's if we're going to construct something new. So what about the grandfathered ones, these people who haven't made a change? Again, the NRCB, when they come out, they're going to just take a look at the facilities. Are they going to do their job? You don't have to prove that they meet the standard, but they have to look like they're going to. Now, quite often our existing facilities are less than 100 meters from a water well. In fact, I've been in several dairy barns where the water well was in the barn, usually by the parlor or the milk room, but it's actually right in the barn. That's not ideal, but we can deal with it because the regulation is about construction. You have to construct 100 meters away. The existing facilities, what the NRCB will do is assess, what's the likelihood that manure could get to that well. And if they have a concern, they may ask something be done. And if it's like the picture I showed where it's perhaps a very sandy site, then they may ask you to monitor that well and report the quality that you find. The other thing that the NRCB will do is look at the soils maps, the drilling reports, geology maps, and plug that information into their environmental risk screening tool so they can get an assessment not just of the facility but the whole site itself. That risk screening tool will give you a score that tells the NRCB how worried they think they should be about a facility, and perhaps require some changes. So that was dealing with the first two parts of the problem or the question you have. The third one is about avoiding spreading on frozen and snow-covered land, which I equate to basically just being a volume and perhaps a management question. And to that one, we had another polling question. I blew right past one of our polling questions. I got so excited in talking, I forgot about it. But we could do the fourth one for sure. Just to see where people are at with their storages. Awesome. So most people already meet the minimum that AOPA establishes, which is 9 months. So you have to have a minimum 9 months when you come in for a permit. Now that can be a combination of what's in your barn, your transfer pit if you have it, or other storages, lagoons, or outdoor pads. There is an exception where you could get a manure handling plan. Those have to be approved ahead of time. That would allow you to have less than 9 months on site, but then the place that manure goes to has to be suitable as well. Just as an aside, because I used to help design facilities for people, quite often they'll want to just submit an application that has if it's a lagoon, they have a hole big enough for 9 months of storage. But you have to think about, that might be good enough to get a permit, but operationally, you have to think about how you're going to manage that. When do you want to spread? Because that can really impact whether or not you have the timing to get through and not have to spread on snow. You have to think about how you're cleaning it out, how you're going to agitate it, because a lot of our traditional methods, we get sludge buildup in the corners or in the middle, which can really take away a lot of volume, easy 2 to 3 months of volume if it gets excessive. And then if you're emptying it in the late fall, so you can get through till spring, usually producers don't want to expose that discharge pipe as it's coming in at the bottom or close to bottom. So they'll leave a certain amount of manure in there to help protect that from freezing. Well, that again takes away 2 to 3 months of storage space. So that can really impact the operational volume. It might be enough to get a permit, but it really impacts your operational volume. Another component of our storage sizing is freeboard. And for most facilities, you have to have a 1/2 meter of freeboard. And freeboard is an amount of space that we leave from the top of our storage to our maximum fill line. Now, primarily it's there for odor control, but it does give us some emergency capacity in those extreme events. But we did have a rule change this year, and we've put a different freeboard in for above ground steel and concrete tanks. So these are slurry stores and those kinds of tanks. That freeboard is now 0.3 meters, and that's to acknowledge that the surface area is smaller, so we don't need as much freeboard to control that odor. We're still providing some precipitation buffer there, but we do know how expensive a slurry store is. So if we can cut down on the number of rings that somebody has to purchase of a say a slurry store tank, then this new rule will allow for that. Now again, we do have some operations that are grandfathered. We do have some operations that have less than 9 months of storage. So what does that mean for them? Well, when AOPA came in, it said that we can, when this part of AOPA came in, sorry, that operations can continue to operate as they were until they're modified or expanded or a risky environment is identified. Well, what that means is if you have less than 9 months of storage, you weren't required to increase to come up to the standard until you go to make a change. And if it was your normal practice, because you hadn't less than 9 months of storage, if it was your normal practice to spread on snow or frozen ground, AOPA would allow you to continue to do that. Now, just because you existed in 2002 is not a license to spread on snow or frozen ground. It has to be because you had a shortage of storage and it was your normal practice. For producers, this is mostly for producers with solid manure storage, but another component that you can use is short-term storage. These are storages that don't need a permit. They don't need an approved liner. But there are limitations about this in that you can only use a spot to store manure in the short term. And that short term is an accumulated total of 7 months out of a 3-year period. So the idea being that the manure won't be there long enough for nutrients to leach down into the soil and potentially impact groundwater. There's also a requirement, not for environmental reasons, but for odor reasons, to stay 150 meters from a residence. And then again, you have to stay that 1 meter above the water table. Now, there's also setbacks from water bodies with short-term storages, and they start at 30 meters and go to 90. The flatter the land you're on, the closer you can be to the water body. So I think that covers everything in AOPA that relates directly to this question. So do we have questions about this information?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Vince. So one of the first questions, and maybe you touched a bit on this in your presentation, but what would you do if you had to spread manure in one of those circumstances, which I think is referring to frozen or saturated ground?
Okay, so now if you're one of the operations that has less than 9 months of storage and you existed, you can just do it. We would advise that you notify the NRCB so that if they get a complaint, they know who's doing it and can tell people it's all right. Now, you can spread on snow and frozen ground, but you also have to do it in a way that it's not going to directly run into a river or stream or something and create a risk to the environment. Everybody else has to get permission from the NRCB before they start. So they need to contact the NRCB as soon as they can when they realize a problem is coming and say, ideally I might have to spread in the next little while. NRCB will work with producers if they think it's a viable solution to find a spot where it can be spread. There are cases where the NRCB has said, it's better to overflow the lagoon than to spread anywhere else. All your other land is higher risk. So sometimes they'll say no. If it's solid manure, they almost always say no.
Okay. Another question that's come in is, can the county overrule the NRCB permit?
The county can't overrule a permit, but the county does get input into the permits. So when you come in to get a new permit, the county is one of the parties that the NRCB will talk to get ideas about the suitability of the site and any conditions that might get put on. But once the permit's in place, the county can't overrule that. What the county does have control over, and I know they have pulled this in some instances, is the counties do control the roads. And so they can put rules on the roads that might impact this.
Okay. The next question that's come in is there funding to upgrade the manure storage? We have an above ground concrete pit and switched to robots and sending wash water to the pit, and we don't have enough room anymore for 9 months, but we can't really afford to upgrade our pit right now.
Well, the CAP program might have been there, but I'm somebody else might have to jump in on here, but I believe right now that program is suspended right now. But keep watching, something may change.
Okay. This might be a question more for Morgan as well regarding proAction, but if all of this is covered under the NRCB regulations, then why does proAction also need to be validating this?
I guess that proAction is not meant to supersede the provincial regulations or the permits required and those types of things. There are obviously a few questions within proAction that are over, like, a little bit different than the provincial regulations, but I think the gist of it is that the validators are on farm to make sure that there's not an active pollution happening at that point in time. So that there's not having somebody that has a pipe hooked up to their lagoon that's going into the neighboring stream or something like that. But that's also part of really what we're talking about in regards to what the validation protocol is. We're still trying to figure out exactly what parts that the validators will be assessing regarding these particular questions. But the intent of the proAction module is not to go above or supersede necessarily provincial regulations in regards to these questions.
Thanks. The next question here is, what happens if the liner gets broken in a lagoon?
If the liner gets damaged, then it's the producer's responsibility to repair it. Depending on what's required, it's probably a good idea to notify the NRCB that has happened and that work will be done. If it's substantial work to repair it, there's the potential. Normal repair and maintenance doesn't require a permit, but if it's something substantial, then that might require a permit. And if it's one of these grandfathered facilities, there may be a requirement to bring it up to current standard. That's up to the NRCB to decide.
Okay. So I guess speaking of grandfathered facilities, the question is there a number of dairies that are still grandfathered?
Well, based on our poll, it sounds like there are still some. We don't have an actual number because they are not required to report to us until they go to make a change. So we know there are still some out there, but we don't know the exact number.
Okay, the next question is, what's considered a naturally occurring protective layer?
Okay, well, a naturally occurring protective layer is your native soil. And what you would have to do is do some testing, usually hire an engineer. An engineering company would come in and do some drilling, and they would do some testing. And depending on which kind of manure storage it is, you have to show that it's somewhere between 2 and 10 meters of this material and has a hydraulic conductivity of 1 times 10 to the minus 6 centimeters per second. So typically what they'll do, if you're trying to prove that it's a naturally occurring protective layer, is they'll install some little wells, some piezometers, they're usually called, into that formation that you're going to try to use as a protective layer. And basically they fill that well, they fill that casing right up with water, and they measure how fast it gets absorbed into the soil. And from that, they can calculate this hydraulic conductivity. And if it meets those requirements, then you could get approved for a naturally occurring protective layer.
Okay, the next question here is, are there the same manure storage laws applicable for compost as they are for raw manure?
Under AOPA, they're considered the same. So yes, it's the same rules.
Okay. And the last question I have here is, if I have to make solutions for my parlor wastewater, what would you advise me? Drain to a septic or a lagoon? Does it matter what I would choose regarding regulations?
Right now, it doesn't matter. Like you said, it's really kind of into a gray area. There's no one legislation that says where it needs to go. So I would say you pick a solution that works the best for you and your site.
Great. So we'll just answer one more question and then move on. Okay, so the question here is, we have always spread year round as we have no storage and we are grandfathered by the NRCB. What will happen with proAction?
So that falls into finding out exactly how the validators will be scoring this, but from the fact that you're meeting the NRCB provincial regulations, then that's great. And there would be nothing in particular that may come across from that. But like I said, there might be some other nuances or whatnot in regards to that. We're still trying to figure out exactly what that's going to look like. But we'll be sure to share that with you as soon as we know.
All right, thank you. And thank you very much for your questions, everybody. Please feel free to keep typing them into the Q&A box, and we should have time to get to them later. But for now, let's move on to our next section.
Okay, so just as we wait for the presentation to get loaded, I'll start talking about it. So it's the 5th question. So as I mentioned, there's just the 5. So EN5 is in regards to managing nutrients or manure management. So do you manage nutrients on your farm to make optimal use of manure on land? So the key points here is that obviously nutrient and manure management is essential in reducing risk of those nutrients and or manure contaminating groundwater or surface water. So you'll see a theme here for sure. And at the time of the validation, there will be one thing that the validators will be looking for, that you must provide a provincially approved nutrient management plan, or what might be more likely the case here in Alberta might be to provide soil test results. And those soil test results would be ones that are done at least at a minimum every 3 years. So there are a number of soil testing tips and considerations for this. So obviously, if you get your soil tested, keep those results. Once again, you could utilize your proAction binder in the environment tab section, although it's not required that it's there. If you have a book or a binder that's dedicated to your field management, then that works too, absolutely. As long as the required information can be provided at the time of the validation, that's what matters. Any fields that have varying soil conditions can be broken into sections, and the analysis should include both the nitrogen and phosphorus contents. So with the last point in regards to the provincial regulations, I will just pass it off to Trevor Wallace, who's a nutrient management specialist, and he will speak to all of the Alberta provincial regulations.
Thank you very much, Morgan. I apologize for the delay in getting the slides up. I was waiting for them to come up. I was watching. I was sort of engaged in the presentation, and I wasn't really realizing that it was my turn to do something. So apologize for that, Morgan. So she said, Trevor Wallace, Alberta Agriculture, going to talk a little bit about manure and nutrient management. Great to be out here or talking to you guys this morning. Much prefer to be in person, but we'll try this method and see how it goes. I sort of broke it up to talk a little bit about this environmental question number 5, manure management, the provincial legislation, components of a nutrient management plan, and what we have for resources and tools. One of the things you're going to see or probably already noticed when you're doing your EFP, there are several chapters in EFP. I think they're chapters 14, 15, and 16 will all really touch on some of these pieces around nutrient management. 15 itself is around nutrient management, primarily fertilizer related. 16 is around manure management. And so a nutrient management plan may be asked if you have one in an EFP. And all the questions within those chapters really speak to different parts of a nutrient management plan. The nutrient management plan itself is really putting all of those pieces together. So we ask questions about application timing or application rates or soil analysis, what methods are used, etc. in the EFP. So when you're going through that, you'll be asked about the individuals, and if you move towards having a nutrient management plan, it's really putting all those together into a tool. And many of you guys are already doing this. It's nutrient management plan is just maybe a little bit more formalized. But before getting into a nutrient management plan, I sort of wanted to repeat what Morgan mentioned. Like, why are we even worried about a nutrient management plan? What are we trying to do with one? I firmly believe if the understanding is there, what we're trying to achieve with the nutrient management plan, whether you follow suggestions I have on how to do it or not, doesn't really matter. If you know what you're trying to achieve, you can come up with the best way for you to do that on your operation with the resources you have. So there's a number of reasons we do a nutrient management plan. The biggest one is economic. Really, when you come from a fertilizer point of view, nutrient management plan, we're trying to reduce either the amount of nutrients we're applying, because we have some from the system, some left over from previous years. The crop we're growing needs a different profile than usual, and we're trying to reduce our losses when we apply it. So it's really for an economic reason. We have a few tools that help you from an economic reason decide where and what to put on, because not everybody has like, I know my budget's limited, not so much by the bank, but my wife limits how much I can spend usually. So I need to put whatever fertilizer I do purchase in target it to where I'm going to get the biggest bang for the buck. Now, connected to that is the agronomic issues. Now, they do connect back to economics, all of them do, but when we apply our nutrients, we can affect the crop or the soil. We can get luxury uptake in the plants. That's the biggest one, you guys, for the dairy guys, you know this, potassium uptake, especially in the alfalfas. If we have really high potassium soils, because we've either naturally have high potassium soils or applied a lot of manure over the years, you get a high potassium, it'll take it up, results in a milk tetany, or may result in milk tetany issues, imbalance with calcium and magnesium later on. Lodging is an issue, and that takes you into disease management, etc. So yes, there are economic reasons. It'll slow your harvest, decrease your quality, but it also has an economic impact. The other biggest thing is an environmental impact. One of the things that research here that we've been able to do over the years, just to show the impacts of soil quality, basically, this happens to be phosphorus specific. Nitrogen, it's somewhat similar, except nitrogen is very mobile in the soil, so it can leach out. So we lose it there, or it can gas off, volatilize. So the numbers won't follow this same trend. But phosphorus, as an indicator, because it does not have that gaseous loss or as much of a leaching loss, virtually none, we can basically see as the soil phosphorus levels increase, the amount in the runoff increases. This would be a fresh manure application. 1 year later, manure application, native soil, same sort of thing. So, our time of risk is really with that first manure application. After it's worked in, a crop's been growing, the amount of loss goes down, but it's still, as it increases in the soil, we lose more in the runoff. So coming back to what Morgan was talking about, which is why we are doing nutrient management, is really water quality. And that can be runoff from facilities, storages or fields, it doesn't matter. Nutrients, sediment, pathogens, but it's not just phosphorus. You'll find phosphorus being the limiting nutrient in most of aquatic systems on land, non-salt systems, non-seawater systems. This happens to be Lake Winnipeg. Oh, sorry, my pointer went away. This happens to be Lake Winnipeg. Then the hypoxic zones, this is the Gulf of Mexico. And this is a lot of nutrients, primarily nitrogen, coming through the Mississippi River system. So this hypoxic zone is really a dead zone because of over nutrients. So this is on the large scale. The impacts that we find across the province can be a lot smaller scale. Dugouts, anywhere our lakes, we get a lot of this activity. So this is what we're trying to prevent with better nutrient management. Now, there's other issues. It could be air quality. This happens to be ammonia loss when you combine it with mountains. This is British Columbia, and a lot of automobile exhaust, so we have smog get produced. There's some soil quality issues, and there's some biodiversity issues, which have happened in places like Europe. Colorado has noticed it again, nutrients ending up where they weren't normally. So we have species change in mountainous or foothills regions because of extra nitrogen. So plants that grew very well in low nutrient environments aren't as competitive ones that can grow with higher nutrient environments, and so we get that. So really what we're trying to manage is the nutrient loss. And we're doing that through various individual practices, or we bulk it up into a nutrient management plan. I think I skipped our first poll question. So I'll move on to legislation while that poll question's coming up. And I just wanted to get a sense, before I talk about it here in a little bit, how many people have nutrient management plans or are currently using a nutrient management plan? And they don't need to be as formal as the ones I'm talking about, but roughly how many people are using them? So if we want to kick that one off, is that okay, Kira? There we go. Perfect. So basically, a nutrient management plan, as we're defining it, is just sort of the plan on how you're managing your nutrients, both your fertilizer and your manure. How's it being applied? Where is it being applied? When's it being applied? The rates you're doing it. Looking at the numbers coming in right now, a majority of you guys are doing nutrient management plans, which is what I expected. So I tried to keep this rest of the presentation very high level to go over some of the areas. There's a lot of tools out there to help you do the details. Thank you very much. So the majority of people are doing it. A few aren't, but probably all of you are. You're just doing it at a different level, and maybe not as detailed as others. So we'll get into that. So under our provincial legislation, and because this is going to be made available to you later, I put the website on. If you want to go to manure management guidelines, you can go to the Alberta Agriculture site or to NRCB if you want to look them up on the web, and you can get into the specifics of the legislation. Vince and I thought we'd give you a thumbnail sketch of what is in the legislation. So Vince did most of this, and I'll just get rid of that. Did most of this manure storage facilities. There's rules and regulations around their construction. There's some rules around short-term manure storages, and those are basically setbacks and timing. For those of the guys using seasonal feeding and bedding sites, I wasn't going to talk about them, but there are some rules around those. And again, those have to do with setbacks and addressing the runoff from those kind of sites. Now, from a manure application point of view, one of the biggest ones is incorporation within 48 hours, unless you're planning spreading manure on direct seeded or forage land or on frozen and snow-covered ground. There has been a change in the regulations with regard to the 48 hours. Unless it's impracticable to do so, which is basically the concept that it is either extremely expensive to do so. In the cases where your equipment broke down, it is not reasonable expectation for you to go buy a new one to finish. This will be decided by the NRCB on a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, our manure applications are supposed to be incorporated within 48 hours. Some may ask why the 48 hours. There's two things at play here. They are interconnected. One of them is odor, offensiveness of the application, and it is nitrogen loss. From your pocketbook point of view, the quicker that we put this manure in the ground, the less nitrogen we can lose. Basically, where the nitrogen, the ammonia has a charge on it, positive charge. We're trying to cover it with soil so that it will bind with clay or organic matter in the soil and not gas off. With manure application, there's also setbacks. All of this will be part of your nutrient management plan, so the incorporation, but also the setbacks, because this is going to change how you apply manure. So depending on how you're applying it, injection, it's 10 meters from a common body of water, and solid manure, it depends on, or not solid manure, sorry, manure that's broadcast and not worked in, it depends on the slope of the land, so it goes out. This creates or complicates our nutrient management plan because now you have an area that you spread manure on and an area that you haven't. So for growing most crops, now you have to figure out a way to either change your fertilizer application for this area, or you just don't. And this area just has a little bit less fertilizer on it. So there are setbacks. There is this 48-hour incorporation. And when I said there's setbacks, the setbacks based on slope to the common body of water. The greater the slope, the greater the setback, essentially. And the purpose of it, again, is trying to affect the runoff, the impacts of this broadcast application on that common body of water. One of the other requirements under our provincial legislation are soil limits. Our soil limits, we have two soil limits. The first one is for nitrogen. So it depends on the texture of your soil, medium fine texture soils, and your soil zone that you're in. Irrigation is on here, as it, even though it's a brown or black soil zone, or dark brown usually, it gets a special number because of the yield potential of irrigated soils, or irrigated systems could use higher amounts of nitrogen. So these are all based on soil texture. The ones with the greatest risk of leaching loss have a lower number than soils with a lower risk of leaching loss. And I mentioned there were two things we have to manage in Alberta, nitrate, nitrogen being one of them. The other one is EC, electronic conductivity, sorry. And you can't apply manure to increase the soil EC by 1 decisiemens, and no apply manure on soils that have 4 decisiemens already. This is all a reflection of salt or sodium content in the soil. It just affects the uptake of plants. And so many people see this whitening of the soil. This is probably groundwater driven, where we're bringing salts to the surface through evaporation, and it affects plants' ability to uptake water. So this limit, unlike nitrogen, which the nitrogen limits around trying to reduce leaching and loss to groundwater, this one is around soil productivity, so that we don't put on so much manure that it's starting to impact the productive potential of that soil. The final one, which was probably of the most interest for you guys, is the record keeping. Anybody dealing with more than 500 tons of manure must keep records. They must be kept for a minimum of 5 years, and soil tests cannot be older than 3 years. So if you're applying manure on a field X this spring, the soil test for that field cannot be older than 3 years, if the NRCB asks for them. Now, records aren't in Alberta required to be sent in. They're there if the NRCB asks to see them. Now, I also will bring it up a little bit later, and for you, that have used the manure tracker app, this happens to be an app that we created with Alberta Milk that allows producers, even with their custom applicators, to keep track of some of these records. And it's all done on your phone, basically. And then it goes to your computer. You have a web portal. You go in through Google or whatever browser you typically use to manage that information. But we created this as just a simple way to try to keep a few more records, or help with records. Now, one of the things that we talk about in this whole presentation is about nutrient management plans. And I want to emphasize one thing. In Alberta, nutrient management plans are not mandatory for operations. We have a couple of reasons why you would do a nutrient management plan. They are if you cannot meet soil salinity or the nitrate limits, and those plans would have to go to the NRCB and approved. It's basically you want to do something different than what our regulations say you must do, you need to create a nutrient management plan. So in Alberta, our legislation does not require you having them. From a best management point of view, I would advocate there's great value to an operation of having some kind of a nutrient management plan, and that'll be purely around economics and benefits to yourself, not from a regulatory tool. Now, Vince also mentioned manure handling plans, which are basically plans that you don't need to store the manure, because instead of keeping the manure is going to somebody else. I'm not even going to talk about those, but those are the two plans under the legislation. And basically the reason for having them is that you want to do something different than what our legislation requires. So that being said, I'm going to try and sell you on why you should have a nutrient management plan. Not required to, but there's value in it. And because there's value in it, I'm sort of going to go into like what's in it, what makes up a nutrient management plan. What do we consider a nutrient management plan, at least here in Alberta? So a nutrient management plan is really about assessing the risks and the resources you have available in the operation, risks of nutrient loss, resources, how you can spread manure, how you can use manure, what opportunities you have from it. We're really looking at trying to balance the nutrients that we apply with what the crop needs, and we're trying to come up with strategies to address any risks that we might have. So essentially, we're trying to make sure the nutrients we collect, store, apply are done as economically as possible and environmentally responsible as possible with the nutrient management plan. And they can be as complex as you want them to be. And they may be done by, a lot of people use an agronomist or a consultant to provide or create a nutrient management plan for them, but they don't have to be done by a consultant. They can be done on the farm, but they need to make sure they provide you value, otherwise they're not really worth your time. So there's sort of two parts to the nutrient management plan. We're going to look at both the yard, the farm level, and the field level. So there's a couple of different things we want to look at. The first thing we sort of do is take an inventory of manure. What are we dealing with? Liquid manure. We're dealing with solid manure. We're dealing with large storages, small storages. In that, like, do I have to spread 2 times a year, 3 times a year, once a year? And how much manure do I have to spread? And in your guys' case, we're dealing with dairy manure, but a lot of operations might be dealing with 2 or 3 or 4 types of manure. Then we can have a different conversation, because every type of manure brings you different value. It's not all the same. Beef manure, dairy manure, not the same. You guys are feeding different things. Poultry manure, completely different animal. So we really want to take an inventory of what we have, when it's available, what we need to spread. When we're looking at the farm, we also look at a facility sort of runoff issue. Like, where's this runoff going from a general nutrient loss point of view? Can be going to a catch basin, so we're going to manage that a little bit differently. This is what happens when a liner erodes. This is an eroded liner from a clay manure storage, earthen manure storage. So basically what you've lost is the ability for it to hold liquid. So it'll basically seep in the ground faster. I'm only referring to that as the previous question that had come up. So we looked at the yard, we looked at our type of manure. The next thing we look at is our cropping system. What do we have available to put manure on? Are we growing crops that need a lot of nutrients, like corn? Are we growing winter cereals so that we have a place that'll start using nutrients in the fall? Help hold the soil, but also start using in the fall. Forages allows us to apply some manure during the season. Like, if you're just growing annual crops where you planted in May and harvest in September, you have 2 real windows for applying manure. So what are our other options? Forages, silage. At least you can get on the field maybe in August. The spring's always hard because the ground the ground's soft generally, depending on how much moisture we have in the spring. Most of our runoff in this province, at least from Red Deer North, 80 to 95% of it comes from spring melt. So we'd like to see as much surface broadcast nutrients as possible in the spring, otherwise you're losing them. But that's not always viable, depending on what equipment we have. Now, if that's your only window, is spring or fall, there are now different machine choices that you can pick to reduce your losses. If forages are an option, then you have between cuts. There's options there, and there's different pieces of steel that we can use to put it on there, something like an airway or a drag line, or just pure broadcast. Silage opens up a different window. Corn, great nutrient user, long season. Again, if we're taking off for silage, that changes. And winter cereals, where does it play in? So we really want to assess the cropping system for 2 reasons. One of them is nutrient use, and the second one is when can we get on and apply the nutrients that we need. One of the other things I'm going to talk about in a minute, it comes back to timing, and hopefully I won't forget that one. At farm level, we also want to look at the equipment. Like, are you hiring it out which is completely fantastic. If you're hiring a custom applicator, it's also great if you're doing it yourself. It's completely whatever you have, both the manpower and equipment to do. And I mentioned there's different types of equipment we can be using. So we, broadcast, which I doubt any of you guys are using this rolling gun. I know when I was working out in the Maritimes, I found this quite amazing how they rolled this out and spread manure basically throughout the season into standing crop with a retracting gun like this. But this is often how we could be spreading our catch basin contents. This is the drag line or injection equipment, just simple broadcast. So what do you have for availability? Custom applicator come in and you follow them with the cultivator because that's what you have time for. You have both, great. It's up to what do you have for equipment. So that's also going to limit when I choose to spread my manure and how I choose to spread my manure. Now, as alternative options is something else that we'd look at from the operation point of view. Are you doing something slightly different? I know I mentioned somebody doing composting. So if you're composting, it's a different beast again. You don't have that volatilization loss from the field application. We're getting loss in the yard. Are you doing solid liquid separation? Again, now we're dealing with two manure streams. They have different nutrient profiles. I can haul the solid manure farther. I can pump the liquid manure or the liquid contents, which is great. It can be done in field. It can be done in season on the standing crop. So there's things to do there. Or am I using like a bedding banister where I'm taking out some of my solids either for myself or for another purpose? So it changes the volume of manure I'm dealing with. So really, when you're looking at the farm level, you're looking at all the resources you have, what you may need to manage it. Now, when we look at the field information, one of the biggest things is to look at every field. Our biggest thing is the soil test, especially if you're not the one doing the nutrient management plan. You're going to have somebody else doing it. They really need to know some of the soil information, not just the nutrients, but the soil characteristics, things that are going to affect the availability of nutrients, the runoff potential, leaching potential, etc. One of the other things that we look at from a farm field point of view, what are the risks for runoff? What's the opportunities to get to them? Now, this happens to be a picture from a US, a friend of mine, where they did a nutrient management plan for an operation. The lagoon's up here, and I just kept it because it was just like highway number 2 here, where farms are on either side of a major highway. How do we get them there? In this case, this was drag lines to get it across versus the tankers going back and forth. But how do we get to those fields? What's the best way to get in, get out? There's some places that we've worked with where they use one road to get to the field. They go out the backside and they use a different road to get to the lagoon so that the tanker is running down the middle of the road. You may say, why is that of interest? Well, it was interest to the county because it reduced shoulder damage when these heavy implements meet each other on the road, but it also reduced the chance of them hitting each other. So they were looking for ways to streamline getting the manure to the field with the lowest amount of risk. Some of them even worked with the counties to shut down a couple of miles of road during spreading time just to make sure the spreaders were the only things running down the middle of the road. Doesn't always work, but there were some opportunities. We also assessed the field for physical features like potential slopes, runoff issues, differences in yield potential. Soil sampling, I did want to focus on that. That's one of the most important tools. It gives you characteristics about your field, assessing it for fertility, diagnosing problems with it. The biggest thing we do with soil sampling is monitoring. Really, the soil sample is the litmus test of how our whole nutrient management plan is working. I can plan out my applications, I can spread it, but if I'm impacting or increasing nutrient levels, the soil testing, that monitoring piece will tell me what's happening. The main difficulty with a soil test is really field variability. How you soil sample this field versus that field, that can be the difficult part. The lab analysis, as long as you go to the same lab year after year after year, and you're consistent. Now, one of the questions I wanted to ask, or the last poll question I wanted to ask, was a soil sampling one. Kira, if we could put that one up, I'd appreciate it. And it was just around how many do you sample, how frequently you sample the same field? Like, is it once a year? Is it once every 2 or 3 or 4 years? How frequently do you guys sample? And the numbers coming in right now are quite consistent with a lot of operations, especially the livestock ones dealing with a lot of manure, are out there every year or two. They may not be taking the same depths every year. Some might be doing that 2-foot depth, and in some years be doing a 6-inch or a 12-inch depth that can go back and forth. But that's great. Most people, 40% roughly, are doing it every year, with another 25% every 2 years and 12% every 3 years, some 3 years and more. And it really probably depends on a whole pile of things, on what crop you're doing and how frequently that field gets manure. But there is value in it. It's a great way to monitor whatever decisions you're making when it comes to nutrient application. Now, deciding on a field strategy for spreading manure, I didn't want to go into too much detail on this, but I did want to mention it really quickly. For you guys that are doing a nutrient management plan, fantastic. I don't have to tell you this. For anybody that's looking at doing a nutrient management plan and they were looking at agronomists or people to do soil sampling and help with doing a nutrient management plan, the most important thing to remember is that you guys, you're the ones in the field, you know those fields, you know the history. That's the information you need for the person to go out and soil sample. You know where the fence lines were. You know how it's been farmed. We've had a lot of fields where this part of the field's been forages for 40 years, and this part has been row cropped for 30, 10, 5. And when somebody comes and doesn't know that, and now it's all the same field, they soil sample, back and forth. Now you've got numbers that don't really represent either one. Yourself, hired staff, your kids, they know this field. They'll be able to come up with the best way to soil sample it. We choose a soil sampling practice based on, if you're looking for an issue. It's very different than if you're just doing fertilizer planning or just tracking what you're doing. The other parts, and moving on from soil sampling, that was enough of a rant on that. When it comes to our field side of things, we also look at all our nutrient sources. We may manure sample, we may not. We have book values, but you can also manure sample. The best time to manure sample is when you're spreading. So you'd basically take a sample when you're spreading, analyze it, and plan for that next year. Because it's just too onerous. It takes too much time to agitate a lagoon to get a decent sample. You're wasting your time. But taking samples out of an agitated lagoon as it's going on, great. There's new technology now where some equipment has on-the-go sampling, especially nitrogen-based, that would tell you, at least make a nutrient map, sort of like a field yield map from our combines, but a nutrient map showing what nitrogen was being put on with the applicator. And any other amendments, like you may be using biosolids, compost from a neighbor. So you can get a sample, or you can use book values. We do have book values. Some of the resources I'll show you, I'll have it. And at least from a planning point of view, it gives you a rough estimate. And then through our soil sampling and crop monitoring, we can adjust accordingly. Now, the nutrient application plan, that's really the heart of it. This is like, what nutrients do I need? When am I going to put them on? The timing am I going to put them on? How and when I'm incorporating them? Calibrating my equipment, etc. That's sort of the heart of the nutrient management plan. So we looked at everything as how much we have, when we can put it on, what equipment we use, and we come up with an application rate and put it all sorted together. How much we're going to lose, how much we're going to apply, etc. And the fertilizer industry has a strong program around right source, right time, right rate, right place. Manure, we do the same sort of thing. For some people, your source is limited with manure, but the lagoon is not consistent material. What's at the top versus what's at the bottom are completely different. You may or may not be agitating both times or all the time that you spread it out. You may just be taking it off the top, so it's a different profile. So you are dealing with different types of manure. Solid manures in there, separated manures in there. You may be dealing with poultry or dairy. So you do have a number of sources, and they're not all going to be consistent. The biggest thing about a nutrient management plan is really, they're a cyclical thing. You sort of look at your resources, plan what you're going to do it, see if it works, evaluate it, make changes, and do it again. So basically what you guys do on every field that you crop it, hope for the best, make changes accordingly with either herbicides, fertilizers in crop, disease and insect management, etc. So I'm going to wrap up real quickly. I just wanted to touch on some of the nutrient management planning resource tools that are all available for anybody that doesn't have a nutrient management plan, wants to get in the nutrient management plan, or just find out a little bit more information. One of our guides is the nutrient management planning guide. It sort of contains all of this, everything I talked about, all the pieces from the soil health, the soil analysis, soil plant interaction, all the way through to that calculating how much manure to apply, book values, etc. So that's its location, but that's what it looks like. One of the other tools that we use, or I use quite frequently, especially when I've gone to guys, we've had several research projects and I want to go out and do soil sampling. Before I've talked to the producer, looked at the field using something called our soil information viewer. It uses AgriSit information. It gives me an overview. It tells me a little bit about the soil that's there, what I'm looking for. If it's, now this line happens to be a divider between two different soil types. You can see it over here. And this half of that pivot, or looks like more than a half, 3/4 of that pivot is one soil type. This one might be a different one. And those differences might be, very subtle and you wouldn't notice them. But I've seen fields where that, areas of heavy clay have been on this half and over here is sand. Knowing that when I go out to go soil sampling tells me either how much I want to combine from this side to this side to put them together, or better yet, maybe I should sample this part differently than this part and send in 2 soil samples. So this gives me some of the background, especially for people where I don't own the land, I've never been on the land. Until I come and talk to you, this just sort of gets me prepared, because then I can ask you some specific questions. Another tool that we've used a lot is Alberta Climate Information Service, or ACIS. We've got or manage several hundred weather stations across the province. Yes, a lot of them are in the forestry or in the green zone, but these are all in the white zone. And if you haven't used them, they provide us a lot of the weather data. I can go back for a field and look at what traditionally you get from moisture, what you've gotten from moisture lately, historic information as well as forecasts. So they're a great tool. They also help from a manure spreading point of view. You can get an idea of wind speeds, etc. If you want to look this information up, they have an app, runs on your phone. So this is great. It's managed by Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. Even though these stations, some of them are environment, some of them are the feds, we do all the data work on these things. So it is another great tool that we have available. We have a ton of resources on risk assessment, be it the EFP, a wintering site assessment tool, the phosphorus, Alberta Phosphorus Management Tool. A lot of things that will help to evaluate a field to determine what its risks for runoff. Are there any risks that we need to manage when we go there and deal with it? We have online calculators like Affirm. This one has been a fantastic tool for many years. It uses Alberta yield curves to come up with fertilizer recommendations. Our last change here last year, the year before, we've added in manure and a few other new technologies like the coated ureas, fertilizer, which changes the nutrient recommendations because of their dynamics, improved efficiency essentially. So Affirm exists, and it's an online tool that you can go into. Before it was a standalone, you'd download the program, run on your computer. It's now online, so it's a great app. And then I already mentioned the Manure Tracker, which is our to help with just record keeping, sharing of information, going back to a single source. You can use it to actually put in a request right to a custom applicator if you wanted to. So just to wrap it up, nutrient management is really around maximizing crop productivity and minimizing nutrient loss. Soil sample, fundamental, 2 reasons: know what you have and to monitor how your plan's working for you. Risk assessment, I think, is key, both in the yard and the field, just to minimize those losses, how we can capture them. Helps really tell a great story. There are legislative requirements. For most of you guys, it's going to be around record keeping, setbacks, and incorporation, but there is not a requirement for a nutrient management plan unless you want to exceed nitrogen limits or EC limits. We do have a lot of tools. I know I covered them really, really quickly, but be open to talk about any of them that you might be interested in. Many of the EFP techs are aware of them as well, and so they're available to talk to about them. But nutrient management planning is essentially a process of planning, monitoring, and adjusting, and repeat. thank you guys. I hope it was somewhat helpful or beneficial, or you can walk away with something. So, Morgan.
Thank you very much, Trevor. So we've got a few questions that have come in for you. So first of all, in how it relates to the proAction requirements, one aspect of the requirement is that you need a provincially approved nutrient management plan. So does Alberta meet that requirement? And if so, who would sign off, and what would be considered valid for the management plan?
Morgan, do you want to say something before I do?
Go ahead. It was my question, actually.
Oh, okay. So there is no provincial plan that you have to have. The only times that you would need one would be for exceeding soil nitrate limits or EC. Then you'd have to send it to the Natural Resources Conservation Board, or NRCB. They're the ones that would approve it for you. For most guys, they wouldn't need one, but if you did have to have one because of those two situations, NRCB is the approval body for reviewing the plan, and basically you have to satisfy to them that what you're planning on doing is going to meet or exceed the requirements in the legislation. Or provide, sorry, not meet or exceed. They need to, what is the wording that we use? Vince can chime in. It is making sure that you're providing equal to protection as the regulations do. So if I want to exceed soil nitrate limits and I feel I can do so because I'm on clay soil and I'm growing crop X and I need that much nitrogen, they would have to be the ones to sign off on it.
Great, thank you. So the next question that's come in is, can you send in a soil sample yourself? So can you avoid using an agronomist? If so, is there a list of labs available somewhere?
Yes, yeah, absolutely you can. There's a couple of labs. I'm not sure if they're listed on our website as much anymore. They should have been. Exova is one of the labs. ALS is another lab. They're based out of Edmonton. Both of them Edmonton. They have labs in Calgary. There is a Down to Earth Labs out of Lethbridge. There's a couple in the province. And yes, you can absolutely do it yourself. You don't have to do an agronomist. It is the difficult part of a soil sample is getting that depth. It's easy to do a 6-inch. A little bit more involved in doing a foot sample is getting that probe in there. The only advantages agronomists have, unless you have this tool in yourself, is a hydraulic soil sampler, which basically can go down to a couple of feet. Actually, we can push ours down to a couple of meters, but that's the biggest advantage of them. But no, absolutely, you can do it yourself. It's a great activity for the kids. Send them to the field for a day and they can get a sample. They basically, if you use a nutrient management guide or a few other tools, they talk about how to do it and send them in and what information the lab needs. And then we can talk about how to interpret the results. The labs generally give you back the results. And part of the information you've given them is you've told them what crops or what couple of crops you might want to grow and what yield you want to get. They run an algorithm that goes with the same yield curves as what's in a firm. They may bump up the recommendation a little bit because of experience that they have, or change the recommendation a bit, but they will send you back a profile of what's in the soil. Many of them will send back comments on what the numbers mean, like what the pH like this means, what the organic matter means. Then they will also send back a recommendation for fertilizer based on that profile and the crop and the yield that you gave them. Many of them also provide you, if I said I want to grow 180 bushel barley in Oyen, they would send me back a fertility recommendation that says how much nutrients I need to do that, but the chance of achieving that's probably 5% based on moisture from my area. More realistically, they'll give me two other yield goals, like average for the area and maybe another one based on real moisture conditions, and give me different recommendations as well, all in the same table. There are labs out of province and out of country that are also do some of this work. And now these are the traditional labs. I haven't even gone into the soil health ones. There's at least one lab in Alberta starting up that does soil health, which isn't really around nutrients, but it's around not just nutrients and texture, but also bacteria and microbes. But the only issue with going to labs out of province is the fertility recommendations they give may not be calibrated for Alberta. We want to make sure the tests they complete, the analysis they do, we often for phosphorus example use modified Kelowna. Other parts of the country use maybe Olson or Malic 3, which may not be calibrated for Alberta soils. That's a problem because the number might not mean what we think it means. And the other issue that we have when doing it, not yourself, but even with agronomists doing it, is sending an analysis this year to this lab and next year to a different lab and so on and so forth. They all use a similar process, but as long as you go to the same lab, you know they're using the same process. They will tell you on the report you get back what analysis procedures they used. Because if you start changing a modified Kelowna phosphorus indices that gives you, it should have this much phosphorus, is different than what an Olson does. They're not equivalent. So if you start going to different labs and using different analysis, the numbers you're looking at aren't going to be the same anymore, and that's a problem. But getting back to your original question, absolutely you can do it yourself. It's not that hard to do. It's just it's a bigger time commitment, harder to go down deep as with a push probe versus a hydraulic.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question I have here is, do I need to soil test all of the fields or just the ones we spread manure on?
From an agronomic point of view, it would be good to do all your fields. From a legislative point of view, it's the fields that you spread manure on. It's within 3 years of when you're spreading, and you need the nitrogen level for a 2-foot depth. So 0 to 24. And I don't care if it's you have a sample for 0 to 6, a sample for 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 broken out that way. It will add it up to make a 0 to 24. You need that 0 to 24. But it doesn't, from a legislative point of view, the fields that you don't spread manure on, they don't fall under that.
Just to echo what Trevor's saying, that from what we're looking at, it's the proAction level is just the soil tests for what you're spreading manure on. And just as a caveat, there is an exception that if you have written advisement from a licensed agronomist, that you wouldn't necessarily need to have those soil sample results for proAction. And we know that there might be some farms that are certain circumstances where manure is actually leaving and they're selling it and they're not actually doing anything with their manure. So that might be something that we're having the conversation at the proAction level as to what that means. There might be some farms, yeah, that just are strictly not dealing with any manure application of any sort on farm.
And then chances are they'd be dealing with a manure handling plan, which is that again approved by the NRCB. Which would basically, a manure handling plan is I'm not spreading my manure, or I don't need 9 months of storage. It's going over here. Then whatever's happening over there, NRCB is going to be interested in, not you.
Okay. So the next question, I think you talked about it a little bit at the end of your presentation, but just a little bit more about, so it's called the Manure Tracker app, and where can producers find that?
We had a website. But you can find it in the App Store or for both Android or iPhones, and it's called Manure Tracker. And be careful, at the same time we developed ours, Minnesota developed one and called it Manure Tracker as well. So there's a Minnesota one. I had to give Kevin a hard time. I happen to know the guys that were doing it down there, and they came up with the same damn name, which is frustrating. But you can go to the App Store, or you can go to in either one, iPhone or Android, but there's also would be a link off our webpage. We'll have it mentioned. Or I'm not sure if Alberta Milk has a link off of their page, because we did it with Alberta Milk, Alberta Beef, Alberta Pork. But I'm not sure, Morgan or Kira, if you have
we're going to be developing a lot of supplemental resources for producers. So we'll make sure whether there's frequently asked questions or a list of all the labs for soil testing, links to all of these different amazing tools that can be used. So yeah, we plan to provide all of that information for sure.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, the next question here is, our land actually slopes down from the water. So is a 10-meter setback enough?
Oh. slopes down from the water is 10 meter setback enough. I think I'd have to know more. If it's away from the water, yes, it'd be enough. If it's injection, 10 meters would be injection. 30 meters if you're even if you're broadcasting and working it in. It's only injection that gets the 10 meter close one. So you'd have to be 30 meters. 30 meters is the most common because of broadcast and incorporation is our most common method of spreading manure.
Okay.
This has come up in the past where the water is actually higher than where the manure is going to be spread. And what happened in those situations where the producer wanted to spread closer, then the NRCB came in and said yes or no whether or not they could do that. Because those setbacks really are meant to cover when the land drains towards the water. But there are a few situations, I've seen a couple in the province where the land is lower than the water.
And so then our risk is probably flooding.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Vince.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. So the next question here is, are the requirements the same for incorporating solid manure as well as liquid manure after spreading?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Now, from a beneficial management point of view, liquid manure probably has higher volatilization loss potential. So ammonia loss potential will be higher with liquid manure just because it's got a higher concentration in it than solid manure, generally speaking. So there's more of a value to working in liquid manure as soon as possible compared to solid. Solid manure's got a lot more nitrogen in an organic form, so it's still in plant material, feces, and it needs to be converted through microbial activity. So there's less loss. So from a legislative point of view, yes, exactly the same, doesn't matter. From a BMP point of view, there can be higher value in working in liquid manure than solid.
Okay, great. This next question is actually, if you could go back to your slide where you listed all of the websites, just so they can have another look at that.
Which ones? The general
maybe,
manure?
Maybe stop here, and then again, Morgan and I are planning on following up with these resources to make sure they're available for everybody who attended.
And here, I'm just going to go back, just 1 second. I'll go back to one slide. This one, that's the act, but from this website, from that website, you can get to all of our tools and resources, and you can get to the legislative website. Deanne, if you just type in manure management Alberta, this will generally come up. I don't know if Deanne
if you go on to Google and you go Alberta Manure Management, that website will come up, and there's a specific link for manure and nutrient management tools. All of the resources that you've mentioned will be listed there.
Along with the page for all the legislation too, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So the next question here is, how often do you have to update a nutrient management plan?
Oh, well, it's sort of that every year you're going to be tweaking it. Like for a specific field, some parts of it you're not going to be updating. The yard assessment, the type and volume of manure probably not changing, but every year or so you're going to be updating the field, the nutrient application piece, because the crop's going to change and the amount of nutrients you're putting on is going to change. So that's really the annual piece that's going to be done. You can look at a risk assessment every year, but chances are, that every, several years. But from a actual application point of view, based on what crop you're growing, moisture conditions, how much nutrients you want to put down, etc., that's the only piece that would be really changing on an annual basis. There are parts of a nutrient plan, depending how detailed you get, when you assess a facility, just like an EFP, there's pieces that we look at every year where we'd say, well, do you go out and check your manure storage for leaks? That would be just sort of a checklist of, yep, yeah, we did that. We check those kind of facilities every year or every 6 months to make sure the structural integrity is still there. But from the nutrient management, the planning of when you're going to spread, that's the piece that we would do every year. Maybe not the whole thing.
Okay. So the next question here is, what's preferable in your opinion, fall spreading or spring spreading, in terms of nutrient availability, compaction in spring, and all of that?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Like, realistically, it'd be ideal if we could do everything in the spring, especially if we're broadcasting, because we've avoided the runoff. If we're doing it in the fall and we can work it in, or we can inject it, we're minimizing the chances of runoff. But in the spring, compaction's the biggest issue we have. Getting a crop on, we already have a short enough window. I could not sit here with a straight face and say everything should be on in the spring. It would be nice. We have technology to do it with drag lines, either through injection or broadcast or trailing hoses, to get it on the ground, get it on fast, and reduce our compaction issue. From an environmental point of view, that would probably be better than in the fall, but there's things we can do in the fall. There are some things around nutrient availability. It takes some time for the soil microbes to break down and make nutrients available. So really fall or spring is somewhat irrelevant in that sense, because depending how late, like if you did August, there's going to be conversion it's going to happen. But if we're talking about October, the amount of conversion is going to be limited, even if it's in the soil, because once it starts to freeze up, those bugs are going to start activity. And in the spring, once it starts to warm up, that's when they start to increase activity. So there may be some slight differences. It would be nice to do it as much as we can in the spring. It's great to be able to do, and that's why I see there's huge opportunities here with solid liquid separation. I know a few places have done that. They've hooked up their liquid manure lagoons then to their irrigation pivot so they can apply it in season. Now it's not pure manure they're putting on. They're putting it on 1 inch out of 10 with irrigation water. So this is really for a limited part of the province, but it's a great way to get around just limiting ourselves to spring and fall. They're applying it in season, which is again reducing our chances of runoff and loss. Okay. Firmly on the fence as a government employee should be.
Great. So we do have a few more questions, and we are going to get them all asked. But just as we're getting close to that noon mark, for anybody who has to leave, I'd like to say thank you to our speakers, and thank you to everybody who's participated in the webinar today, and for your great engagement and asking questions. And just to mention that this webinar was recorded and will be made available on the proAction website. And any of the resources and tools that were mentioned today, we'll also be putting together a document and linking to those. So again, likely on the proAction website, or be sending them out. So thank you very much for joining us today. Oh, Morgan, did you have anything to say to wrap up before we continue with our last few questions?
And just quickly as a reminder that obviously the important thing is to be making sure that on a day-to-day basis that you're meeting all of the applicable provincial regulations over and above what's required of the environment module in itself. So like Kira just mentioned, we will have a list. We actually have a slide next that we can bring up, so you can even just take a quick snapshot of it with all of the contacts for everybody who was involved in the presentation today, so that if you have any particular questions that relate to your farm and your operation, that you can contact the respective specialist directly. So as Kira mentioned, thank you very much for your time and participating, and we will continue on as questions keep coming along. So thanks again.
Great. So Trevor, do you actually mind to stop sharing your screen, and I'll just invite all the speakers to turn on their cameras again?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So the next question is for you, Trevor. So does dairy manure change nutrient composition by seasons or by what we feed?
Yes, it does. Whether you'll notice it completely, because once we start putting in a large lagoon, that's going to be different. But yes, depending on what we feed, there's basically what we're getting on our manure. Roughly 80 to 90% of the nutrients we put into the animal come out the back end. So changing from the silages, changing the amount of alfalfa, et cetera, going into the ration will change the nutrient profile. Depending on how big the lagoon is, whether you notice it or not, chances are you're going to notice more of a difference as you empty the lagoon, because at the time it sits in the lagoon, it's going to settle out. Large lagoons, when we start agitating, and Vince can speak to this really well, depending on how we're agitating. Early on, the nutrient profile is going to be different than later on, because the amount of solids in the manure as we get it out is going to change. Vince, do you have any comments you want to make on nutrient profile in a lagoon?
Well, the main point is it does vary significantly. The liquid portion tends to have less phosphorus, and the phosphorus that's in it is soluble and subject to runoff. And then as we get down in through the profile and it gets thicker, we obviously have more of the phosphorus there. Trying to predict what you have, there's been lots of research done to try to show or to determine how it varies through thickness and depth. But like our typical lagoon, there's some research that said, before you could say truly what the average is in there, you might have to do several hundred samples. So really the solution is do a good job of agitation and try to get it as consistent as possible before you start, if you want to apply a uniform product, or just try to take into account as you go that it's varying.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this question is a little bit adjacent to what we've been talking about today, but it's what's the best practice for silage and baleage plastic, and how do you go about this? So I'm not sure if that's something that anyone can answer here today.
Does anybody with EFP want to tackle that one?
I know that there have been some test pilot projects going on with recycling silage plastic and grain storage plastic. There are bale wrappers, and I'm just not certain of where the facilities are, though, that you can take that clean plastic to be recycled. But Devin, do you recall?
I don't actually know where the pilot projects are either, but if you do look up online, you can just type into Google or something, Alberta eggs plastic recycling, and that pilot project with, I believe, Clean Farms will pop up, and it'll show you all the transfer stations or the land sites that are accepting silage plastic.
Great, thank you very much.
The other resource for you there is probably your ag fieldman, because they're aware of that project and they can probably direct you to where that is.
Okay, the next question that was voted up here was, do you have an estimate of how much an agronomist charges? And I'm assuming for the nutrient management plan.
Oh, not a good number. From some of the agronomists, nutrient management plan can be part of their annual thing, which could be, dollars, from cents to $1 something an acre. And that comes into, they scout the fields, they monitor the fields all season long. The nutrient management is one piece of it, but, they do the soil sampling as part of that. And then the ongoing evaluation of bugs, insects, disease, and the whole package. So that ends up being, $1 or $2 per acre for the season. For just doing a nutrient management plan, no, I don't have any good estimates. I'd have to talk to some of the guys I know to see what they're charging.
Okay. So the next question was actually asked earlier in the chat, so I believe it's for Vince. But in terms of manure storage, what if cows are housed on a bedded pack?
So if they're housed on bedding like that, then we would call that solid manure. And so then the rules for solid manure apply. So your barn, same rules apply. You've got to have 9 months of storage, but typically we would consider the barn to have that. And if you're going to store any outside, that would be a solid manure storage or a compost pad. They're the same thing under the legislation. So all those same rules would apply.
Okay. So this question actually came from Devin, but for some of the older environmental farm plans, they only provided a letter of completion and not an EFP certificate. So in terms of the proAction validation, will the validators accept either the certificate or the letter of completion?
Yes, as long as there is something that comes from EFP stating that the producer has completed it, and it has the ability to know what that date of completion was, so they can tell what the validity, then that would be fine.
Okay, and there's also a question related on the Q&A. So it's, does the EFP get automatically validated by the province online? So I'm assuming that's referencing proAction there again.
I think it might relate to if the EFP is completed online, how that gets validated or I guess reviewed by a EFP tech, because all of our stuff will just be strictly whatever comes from the EFP people for the producer for the letter, I guess, of completion. So I guess maybe if EFP can touch base on how they review the completed EFP for a producer and any follow-up that's required.
Murray, do you want me to answer this one?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so how an EFP is validated online is once a producer has completed their EFP, they will submit it and their technician will get a notification that the EFP has been submitted, and then that technician will review the EFP and either approve it, or if they have any concerns or questions, they might request revision and get the producer to change a few things and then resubmit it. And then once it is approved, that's when they will receive a EFP certificate and letter of completion, and that's all through email. And it's just, they'll automatically get those as soon as it's done.
Perfect, thanks. So this question, I believe, is for Trevor. We are using a product that binds the nitrogen into a less volatile form of nitrogen in the manure. Are there any comparable studies done that prove that this is a good practice?
Oh, there's a few, but not that many yet. We were actually doing one here in Alberta. We were doing it for binding of nitrogen. We're doing it for greenhouse gases, and there are several products on the market that do a good job of doing that. Our biggest issue that we came across wasn't that it didn't work. It was the mixing it, getting a nice mixture. It took a while to our agitation. We were putting it in. The tankers seemed to be the easiest for us to put it in rather than a lagoon. Plus the volume was just that much easier to manage. It took time to do it, but they are a good option. And I've heard more people trying to use these products. It's some of them are very similar as the urease inhibitors that we put on our fertilizer, or with fertilizer. It's just putting it in with the manure. So I would have to look for studies. Like I said, I know of the ones that we were doing here with the U of A that talked about the different products. I could get you links to their research, and then I have to go looking for some of the other ones.
Okay, but it's a product that's out there and it's being used, and
yes,
just figuring out the best way. Okay.
Yeah, we did it years ago with a liquid dairy injection project with some dairies, and then in the last 6 years, we've done several projects with U of A on this topic.
Okay. So the last question that's in the Q&A box right now is, how long does it take to get a permit by the NRCB?
That's really going to depend on what you're applying for. NRCB has a target that they try to have their decisions made in 65 working days from when it's deemed complete. So a producer has to fill out the forms and get all the information that the NRCB feels they need to make a decision. That doesn't, the clock doesn't start according to the NRCB till that information is provided. And then that process starts. Right now for most permits, then they have to notify affected parties, which might include neighbors and the public, but always includes the municipality. They give 20 working days, roughly a month, to do that. And then once all that information comes in, then they make their decision. And I believe they're averaging for simple ones like authorizations to add on to a manure storage pad or something like that. It's taking about 35 working days to, and then they have some that go beyond the 65. So figure their process is going to take anywhere from 2 to 4 months, and whatever time you need to put that information together. I usually tell people plan for 6 months from when you start working on your application to when you can reasonably consider having a permit.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's all the questions that we have for today. So I'd like to thank our speakers again. Thank you very much for your time and your expertise. And again, thank you to our participants for joining us today. And there will be a survey. Once you leave the webinar, the link will come up. It will also be emailed to you. If you could please fill out that survey, it just helps us provide better information for you in the future. And then I will say that on behalf of proAction, we'll be using a lot of the questions today to create FAQ sheets. We'll be putting resources together and following up, hopefully with more training in the spring or summer, which might either be online again or in person. Morgan, is there anything you wanted to add before we close down for the day?
Oh, I think Trevor might, so go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to point out, Deanne has been diligently throwing in some links. So the Clean Farm link, she put in a little bit about the tracker just in the chat. So first of all, thank you, Deanne, for doing that. But also, if anybody was looking, there they are. That's it.
Perfect, thanks. No, just would like to echo Kira's comments on thanks again to our speakers. And thanks to all of our producers who were able to log in for at least a period of time or the whole session. And we will have this available for you to rewatch, or for those who were not able to attend, they will have the ability to review it as well at their time. So once again, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.